I think we're in the early stages of a global conflict. I don't say that lightly. I've been thinking it for a while. Here's why I think it's the case. First, I'll take you back to April in 1940, very start of World War II. It had only been underway for 6 months. The Nazis had overtaken Poland. There was technically a war declared between England and Germany. There were no major engagements between those two countries yet. Germany had taken over parts of Western Europe. They were getting ready to move into Scandinavian countries. But there was no major conflict in that sense yet. There was a war in Asia. So Japan had invaded China, and Nanking and various other parts were deep in conflict. And if you ever want to read a horrible book about it, The Rape of Nanking talks about just how savage that battle was. Russia was not yet a full combatant in the war. The Eastern Front had not yet opened up. So you've got this situation where you've got a couple of expanding powers, being Japan and Germany, that have started conflicts. And the Americans hadn't been fully pulled into war at this point. The United Kingdom was technically at war but hadn't fought at that stage. Now, within 18 months, from April of 1940, the entire world was consumed in war, starting with, in the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, which was the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, commenced, and that drew the Soviets into a very severe Eastern Front conflict. And then in December of 1941, the Japanese ended up attacking the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December 7th, 1941. Very significant attack, very severe damage inflicted on the American fleet. 2,400 sailors lost, many ships sunk in a severe blow to the American Pacific fleet. And again, that drew America straight into the war, and Germany shortly after declared war on the US as well. And then the world spent the next kind of 4 years fighting to liberate Western Europe and also to liberate the Pacific as well. The Allies ended up winning that conflict at the loss of tens of millions of lives. Now, fast forward to 2025, we have what I think is the first issue. We have multiple front wars in multiple theaters of war. So we have a major conflict happening in Europe at the moment, which is Russia against Ukraine. That is an extremely serious conflict, and it is dragging on and becoming, it runs the risk of drawing NATO into that conflict. Secondly, we have a huge conflict that has unfolded in the Middle East between Israel and its opponents. That's been occurring since the attack on Israel, or the October 7th attacks, which were an existential threat to Israel, and they've taken the opportunity to fight back and to target Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, Gaza. Pretty much any enemy they had, they use it as an opportunity to inflict damage on them. And the US has also been drawn to that war through Operation Midnight Hammer and the targeting of Iranian uranium enrichment facilities. Now, there are two theaters. The third theater, which is underway but is not yet a hot war, is China and its effort to reclaim Taiwan, which it sees as its own domestic domestic sovereignty, basically its own land. Now, China and Taiwan have a long history. It was occupied in 1949 by the exiled nationalist army led by Chiang Kai-shek after losing the civil war to Mao's forces. Communist forces in China established government. Taiwan had its own breakaway government and has since become a thriving democracy and quite a rich state. And China has maintained itself as a communist nation and has always claimed there is only one China that incorporates both countries. It's been formally recognized by the United States and other countries. They all have a one China policy. However, Xi Jinping has stated that he will reunify Taiwan with the mainland of China, and he has asked his defense force, he's ordered his defense forces to be ready to reclaim the island by 2027, and he's preparing his people for conflict. This has been going on since 2014, roughly, when America had its hands full trying to extract itself out of two wars, and in the South China Sea, China was able to go and occupy a number of islands in that part of the world, effectively militarize them, turn them into military outposts in order to try and protect its maritime approaches. Now, Taiwan is the big question. Whoever controls Taiwan controls the world. And I think if the Chinese decide to make a move on Taiwan, that will ignite full-on Third World War. I think there's a reasonable chance of it happening. All the signs point at them preparing to use force to do so. Some of this could be signaling. Obviously, if you've ever seen anything about game theory. It's common sense, but there is actually mathematics to it in game theory. If you're able to signal to opponents, it can change their decision-making calculus. And from what I see, China's working really hard to be able to retake Taiwan without having to fight for it. The way it's doing that is united front operations, changing people's opinions, making it look like it's preordained that the Chinese will eventually be fully unified with Taiwan. So this is the most we're at the end game with this stuff. I think it's been bubbling away, especially since 1996. There was a crisis at that point where China threatened a breakaway government that was in Taiwan. The Americans reinforced the Taiwanese with a carrier battle group. And there's been a few slip-ups on this in terms of policy. President Biden was asked whether he would send troops to support Taiwan in the event of Chinese offensive operations to retake the island. And he said yes. He said yes. It wasn't a mistake. If you've seen that footage, he knows exactly what he's saying. What he's saying is yes.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are.
That's the commitment we made.
And that goes against one of the principles that the US have had for many years, which is strategic ambiguity around Taiwan. They wouldn't commit to supporting it one way or the other. That ambiguity is designed to provide deterrence on the part of China making decisions about whether to enter that war. So, number one, you've got major front wars, multiple areas, and you've a potential one in Taiwan, which is already, you could call it a Cold War. This is being fought on multiple fronts, short of what you would call kinetic warfare. Part two, we've actually got the Axis and Allies blocks and alliances starting to both expand and consolidate. So with the Allies, which is really the Five Eyes nations, Australia, US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, the main kind of Western nations, we've formed a new alliance, which is AUKUS. That stands for Australia, United Kingdom, and United States, including the transfer of 3 Virginia-class nuclear submarines under Australia's sovereign control. Australia's done this as part of a, deterrence package. We were originally building diesel submarines with France. We cancelled that contract because of the escalating tensions with China and the need to be able to project into that area. I think this is a pretty risky play. I think it ties us to entering a war with the US. If you think they're just going to give us their crown jewels and not expect us to come to their party when there is a conflict in the Pacific, that's wrong. Of course, they're going to expect that. And I think that kind of compromises our sovereignty a bit. However, the firepower won't be such a bad thing. So AUKUS is one. Australia is now hosting a lot more in the way of US forces. If there is a conflict, Australia sits far enough back from the Pacific that it is a bit harder to target, but it is a staging area in the north of Australia for US forces, which happened in World War II during the Pacific War. So watch this space. In Darwin, they've made space to be able to take on airstrips with B-52 bombers, hardened fuel facilities, a heap of money being spent on expanding those airfields and getting ready for conflict. There's also been an expansion of NATO. So as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you've now got NATO countries starting to expand. Sweden and Finland both have been neutral and have not joined NATO, have now become a part of NATO. The current US administration has pressed European companies to increase their defense spending. I think this is totally fair. If you look at the history of NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it was formed in 1949 in response to the Soviet threat. And sure enough, France was best friends with America when there were 10 Soviet divisions parked in East Germany waiting to come across the border. Now they're not as interested in defense spending, but I think the US administration has fairly pushed them to increase their defense spend because traditionally the US has shouldered a lot of defense spending on behalf of their allies. So that's the push they're making. They've made the same push to Australia. Defence Secretary Hegseth visited not long ago and pushed our Defence Minister, Richard Marles, to try and increase the government spending, which is pretty paltry at the moment. I think it's increasing to 2.3% of GDP by 2030 or something. It's a tiny increase. You've got the government talking about the worst strategic circumstances we've faced since World War II, and we're meant to be acquiring nuclear submarines, and our defence budget hasn't moved in any meaningful way. I've said this in an old video. Australia is the size roughly of the continental United States of America. Our defence force could fill half of the Melbourne cricket ground. It's a sports stadium in Australia. We're a tiny military, and although we have good equipment and advanced stuff, we just have no mass and no real ability to generate force. We're very much a niche coalition contribution military. We got badly exposed in the late 90s when we tried to commit to East Timor in a peacekeeping operation. We couldn't even deploy properly to a country that was 300 kilometres offshore. And so the government at the time spent probably a decade trying to modernise the defence force. which I was a beneficiary of because I joined the military in the late 90s, and throughout the 2000s we did get a huge modernisation push. But we're at the point now where our Defence Force, we do have some decent equipment, but we're very small. We're just very small. And in any conflict, you're going to need huge reserves of munitions, a huge logistics tail, a lot of soldiers, a lot of transportation options, particularly naval and commercial transportation options. We just don't have any of it. We also don't have domestic manufacturing for a lot of weapon systems, petroleum, oil, lubricants. We just don't have enough to sustain ourselves if we suffer from a blockade. So I know policymakers know this. I know they're trying to improve it. There's just not. We're just a sleepy country here. We just don't get that stuff. And I think we're in for a rude shock when it comes. So interestingly enough, I've heard feedback that there are fairly senior defence members that have seen this channel. So that's probably my push, is the logistics and the mass we need to be able to sustain ourselves in a war should be happening now. So all these smart munitions that we have, they'll be expended, and I think the estimate is within 8 days of a conflict, most of our smart munitions that the United States has will be expended. So it will go back to conventional, standard, dumb artillery and brute force operations, right? Mark my words, it will degenerate into that. Look at what happened to Russia. They had all these advanced targeting platforms, ballistic missiles, everything. It doesn't matter. They all get used. They can be effective, but over time, it just becomes a grinding war. So Australia needs to be able to face that type of a conflict. On our opponent's side, we have a lot of cooperation that is happening that we haven't really seen in the past. I'll give you an example. North Korea has provided up to 10,000 soldiers to Russia to use in ground operations. Now, they've lost, killed and wounded, I think it's nearly 6,000 of those soldiers, really severe. However, they have learned a lot about modern warfare just from those deployments. And you now have a cohort of North Korean soldiers that are trained in modern military operations, including whatever the Ukrainians and Russians have been able to throw into battle. They'll take that back to North Korea and they'll train their entire defense force with that cohort of people. So they've just taken a huge leap forward in their combat capabilities. Whether you like it or not, that's where they're at. They're going to be a much better defense force than they once were. And that early advantage that the AUKUS allies have will be lost because we basically have a lot more combat experience than those folks. So that's one. So they provided support to Russia in the form of munitions as well, a lot of manufactured munitions and also personnel, and they're going to provide more. Iran, they provided proxy war support. So as I mentioned before, the Houthis, Hezbollah and whatnot to target Israel, and also drone production. They provided Russia with a lot of drones to be able to initiate their wars. China has also provided the opportunity for sanction avoidance to Russia, so shipping of oils and whatnot, get around American sanctions, and they've also increased their trade reliance on the other countries. So you've got this Axis bloc that is cooperating economically, military, politically to try and improve their lot. We're at the start of a major conflict. I can just feel it. This is a huge Cold War that's just bubbling away, and it could expand at any point in time. I've covered Taiwan. I think that's a major flashpoint, and that was the third part of this video I was going to discuss. The wild card in all this, which is the fourth part, is nuclear weapons. So these weren't held by major combatants in 1940. They are now. 2 of the AUKUS members have them. US, UK, France does have nuclear weapons. Israel does have nuclear weapons. China does. Russia does. North Korea does. And you can see why Iran did try and procure nuclear weapons, because once you have them, you're basically untouchable. The American military won't go near you if you do have those weapons. So you can see why they tried to get them. It's a major deterrent to fighting forces going up against another country that does have nuclear weapons. So I don't know how that plays out. I don't know if that reduces the chances of major power conflict. Well, it does, obviously, because we haven't fought major power conflicts since World War II. But nuclear war on its own, even if a small nuclear device is used, Rand Corporation has done studies on this. Almost every time it escalates into global nuclear war and basically the destruction of the human species, which is pretty terrifying. If you want to hear about it, this book by Annie Jacobson, this is an absolute cracker of a read, Nuclear War Scenario. Probably one of my favorite nonfiction authors. She's got really good access to high-level people in the Pentagon. She writes about all sorts of interesting defense matters, but that lays out a scenario where North Korea uses a nuclear weapon against the US and it escalates into all-out warfare. And it talks about the fallout from a global nuclear conflict. It's actually much worse than they originally predicted. The amount of ash and soot that goes up in our skies basically means that most of the world suffers a severe famine for about 10 years. Daylight temperatures in Ukraine are freezing for 7 years straight. It's actually, the modeling is much more advanced than it was in the 1980s when they started doing it, and that's a terrifying book. The other book that's worth reading, and I'll do a whole video on this, by the way, because this is interesting stuff, The Doomsday Machine by Daniel Ellsberg. This is even better than the other book, because this guy wasn't a journalist. He was actually a nuclear war planner. And there's not much stuff around on nuclear strategy for a good reason. It's pretty secret. But you might recognize that name, Daniel Ellsberg. He was the whistleblower that released the Pentagon Papers in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, which is really damning for the American military. It shows they weren't listening to their own assessments that the war was failing. It was really damning. He's quite a celebrated whistleblower, I guess. In his book, he releases some material. He's actually passed now, but some of the material he releases is very top secret. I think he would have been Q cleared, which is the nuclear weapons compartment, but he worked for the RAND Corporation. It was a major think tank. He was briefed on nuclear weapons strategy, and some of it was absolutely horrifying because these decisions about employing nuclear weapons were being made by non-elected officials in the Defense Department, and this was going to affect all of humanity. So he was not happy about it. I think that's a problem in military circles. Sometimes they do forget that they're not elected and they don't represent the interests of their country. They're just responsible for prosecuting wars. And in this case, some of the targeting missions that were being run in nuclear war strategies were absolutely horrifying, including lateral targeting. So what that is, if I'm a superpower and I have a nuclear exchange with another superpower, I'll actually laterally target other countries so that they are not the ones left standing to inherit the Earth. So this is when you read it, it makes you wonder what drugs they were taking when they came up with it, because it just would mean the end of the human race. So the introduction of nuclear weapons since World War II has totally changed that balance, and what that means in this conflict, obviously it adds a pretty complicating layer to it. So final point, what do we do about all this? I actually don't know. It's a very intense world scenario. Now, I was a history undergrad, I was a politics undergrad, studied 20th century history and going back beyond that, but particularly the Cold War, World War II, World War I, and some of the conflicts since then. And this carries all the hallmarks of a major conflict unfolding soon, and even the pressures that societies were under in the lead up to these wars, including before World War II. We had a major depression. We had the Spanish flu and pandemics in 1918. The world was just getting hammered. So nationalist governments became quite popular, and fascism became a viable force back then, which is pretty scary. So you're seeing some of that now. We've been under extreme pressure with the financial crisis in 2008 and the pandemic that occurred in the early 2020s and this ongoing Cold War. So keep your eyes peeled for it. It's pretty crazy. If you want the links to any of those books, they'll be in the description. See you again soon. Hopefully I've got a more uplifting video for you next time. See you later.